Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into a set of information that you brought to us that's focused on recent international developments. Specifically, it looks like we're going to be talking about some political leaders and the ongoing situation involved in Ukraine and Russia. Right.
Yeah, that sounds about right. You actually sent over a YouTube transcript that touches on protests in places like Hungary, Serbia, and Georgia. And then it goes on to talk about some of the diplomatic efforts led by European and Canadian leaders, statements from Zelensky, and it even touches on what former President Trump has been up to and saying recently. So our mission, I guess you could say, is to try to unpack all these seemingly interconnected events and understand what's really going on.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover. And like you said, it's all kind of interconnected, right? So it feels like a lot is happening all at once. And just for our listeners, the primary source that we're going to be looking at today is, like I said, a transcript from the Midas Touch YouTube channel. So it is coming from a certain perspective, and we're going to try to extract, most crucial information and connect the dots for you. But hopefully, by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a pretty good understanding of all these rapidly changing international affairs. Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this stuff could actually be an indicator of some, significant shifts in global alliances and tensions that are happening right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I think the information that we're going to be discussing today, has the potential to be, uh, I guess you could say, eye-opening. There are some surprising aspects to all of this, some aha moments, as we delve into the details.
Yeah, some things that definitely made me raise my eyebrows when I was reading through it all. Okay, so I think a good place to start, and tell me if you think this is the right way to organize this, is to kind of start geographically. And the transcript really goes into detail about what seems to be a wave of political unrest that's happening in Eastern Europe right now. And it specifically mentions protests in Hungary, Serbia, and Georgia. So, I don't know, what do you think? Should we start there?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's definitely a focal point of the transcript, and I think it's really interesting to see how these protests are kind of connected, to the bigger picture.
Yeah, and the first one that it talks about is protests happening in Budapest, Hungary. And the target of these protests seems to be Viktor Orban, who is, well, the transcript calls him a leader that's admired by Donald Trump. And it really emphasizes how many people are out in these protests. It says there are tens of thousands of people in the streets calling for Orban to resign. It even has a quote from, I guess, a rising opposition leader in Hungary who basically says, "It's over for you, comrade." Pretty strong words.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. And I think it really speaks to, how much people are dissatisfied, with Orban's leadership.
Yeah, I mean, when you see that many people out in the streets, you know something big is happening. And I guess the question is, what's driving this anger? Like, is it just Orban's policies? Or is there something more to it?
Well, I think you have to consider the context, right? The transcript specifically mentions this admiration that Orban has for Trump. So you have to wonder how much of that is influencing his leadership, his policies, his rhetoric, and how that might be playing into the protests. Maybe people are seeing a drift towards, I don't know, more authoritarian tendencies or closer alignment with a figure who's seen as divisive internationally.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you think, right? Like, if you have a leader who's modeling themselves after someone like Trump, and Trump is obviously a very polarizing figure, then it stands to reason that that could create some serious divisions within the country. And it's interesting, right? Because the transcript also mentions that Orban's approval ratings are actually dropping.
Yeah, it does say that. So it does seem like there's a growing uh, discontent, with his leadership. It makes you wonder, how much of that discontent is directly tied to this perceived alignment with Trump and his ideology.
Right, because, I mean, like we said before, it's all interconnected. So it's not just about domestic politics, right? It's about how Hungary positions itself on the world stage. Okay, so that's Hungary. But the transcript doesn't stop there. It also goes on to describe what's happening in Serbia, and it calls it massive uprisings, massive protests. And these are happening in Belgrade against the Vučić regime.
Right, and the transcript is pretty clear that this regime is, characterized as being allied with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, there's no mincing words there. And the imagery that they use is pretty striking. It talks about potentially hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets protesting. It makes you think about, those iconic images of the Berlin Wall coming down or the protests in Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, it definitely conjures up those images. And I think what's really interesting about the Serbian case is, Serbia has historically had this kind of complex relationship with both the West and Russia.
Right. It's kind of been this balancing act for them.
Exactly. So to see these massive protests, against a regime that's seen as closely linked with Putin It really makes you wonder if this is a sign of a shift in public opinion. Maybe there's a growing desire to move away from Russia and more towards the West.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, if you see your neighbor, Ukraine, being invaded by Russia, and you have a government that's friendly with Putin, it's going to make you question things.
Absolutely. And I think it also highlights the power of these public demonstrations. They can be a real catalyst for change.
Right, they show that people aren't just going to sit back and accept things they don't agree with. Okay, so we've talked about Hungary, we've talked about Serbia, and the transcript also briefly mentions protests in Georgia. And again, it's against what it calls a Putin-backed regime.
Yeah, and while it doesn't go into as much detail about the specifics of the Georgian protest, I think it's important to note that they're happening alongside these other protests in Hungary and Serbia. So it seems like there's a kind of a broader trend happening across the region.
Right, it's not just isolated incidents. It seems like there's a wave of unrest, and it's all kind of directed at leaders who are seen as being too close to Putin.
Exactly. And I think if we look back at what we were talking about earlier with Orban and his admiration for Trump, it makes you wonder if there's a connection there as well. Like, is this also a pushback against leaders who are perceived as prioritizing their relationship with Russia over closer ties with the West or with democratic values in general?
Yeah, it's definitely a question worth considering. It seems like the world is becoming more polarized, right? And these protests could be a sign of that. Okay, so we've talked about the unrest in Eastern Europe, but there's another big piece of this puzzle that we need to talk about, and that's Ukraine, and specifically this thing called the Coalition of the Willing.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So the transcript talks about how this coalition, which is essentially a group of European and Canadian leaders, got together virtually to discuss, well, their ongoing support for Ukraine. And it highlights a key point, which is that they seem to be, how do I put this? They're not exactly thrilled with Donald Trump.
Yeah, they're a little wary of him, to say the least. And it goes on to explain why, right? Because apparently in the past, Trump tried to exclude them from certain discussions and negotiations, particularly when it came to dealing with Ukraine and Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. So there's this underlying distrust, I think among these leaders that Trump might, try to sideline them again if he were to regain power.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, we've been down this road before and we're not going back. And it's interesting, right? Because the transcript also points out that the U.S. wasn't even part of this meeting, which, I don't know, that seems kind of significant to me.
Yeah, it's definitely noteworthy. It could be interpreted as a deliberate distancing a way for these allies to make a statement about their commitment to supporting Ukraine, regardless of what's happening in U.S. politics.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, look, we're serious about this, and we're not going to let anything get in the way of that, even if it means going around the U.S.
Right, and I think it's worth pointing out that the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, made a statement after the meeting where he emphasized their commitment to maintaining momentum for a just and lasting peace, strengthening aid to Ukraine, and increasing pressure on Putin.
Yeah, they're definitely sending a clear message, and it's not exactly subtle. So what exactly are they proposing? What's their plan here?
Well, one of the main points of discussion seems to be this proposed 30-day unconditional ceasefire for Ukraine. It was put forward by Zelensky. And the transcript really highlights how he's using this to position Ukraine as the party of peace.
It's a smart move, right? Because it kind of puts the onus on Russia to either agree to the ceasefire or be seen as the aggressor who's refusing to even consider peace.
Exactly. Zelensky is basically forcing Putin's hand here. He's saying, look, we're willing to de-escalate. The ball is in your court now.
But of course, it's never that simple, right? Because the transcript also goes into detail about Putin's response, and it's not exactly enthusiastic. He basically said that he needs to do a painstaking study before agreeing to any kind of ceasefire. And he keeps talking about needing to address the root causes of the conflict.
Yeah, and the transcript kind of interprets that as Putin basically saying that he needs to eliminate Ukraine and its military capabilities before he can even consider peace.
Which is a pretty terrifying thought. But it also doesn't sound like a guy who's really interested in peace, does it?
No, it doesn't. And his whole focus on root causes, which some people might interpret as needing to fundamentally restructure or even dismantle Ukraine's military, I think that really reveals his broader objectives here. He's not just interested in a temporary ceasefire. He wants a permanent solution that ensures Russian dominance in the region.
Yeah, it's a power grab, plain and simple. And the fact that he's also worried about Ukraine using a ceasefire to rearm and build up its forces, I mean, that just shows you how little trust there is between the two sides.
Absolutely. And his demand for control and verification mechanisms, I think that just highlights how suspicious he is of any move that Ukraine makes.
Right, he's not going to give them an inch. So how did Zelensky respond to all of this?
Well, according to the transcript, Zelensky basically said that if Russia rejects this ceasefire proposal, they're not just disagreeing with Ukraine and this coalition of allies, They're also disagreeing with something that Trump himself had suggested in the past.
Oh, so he's using Trump as leverage. That's pretty clever.
Yeah, it's a really smart move. He's essentially putting Putin in a bind here. If Putin rejects this ceasefire proposal, it's going to make him look bad internationally. It's going to make it look like he's not even willing to consider something that a former U.S. president, someone he supposedly had a good relationship with, had proposed.
Yeah, it's a way of isolating Putin diplomatically, make him look like the unreasonable one. So it seems like there's a lot going on the international stage, and a lot of it is revolving around Ukraine. But the transcript also touches on some, well, let's call them interesting developments with former President Trump. And one that really caught my eye was this post about General Keith Kellogg.
Yeah, this is where things get a little confusing, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher. So Trump made this post about appointing General Kellogg as his special envoy to Ukraine, and he said that Kellogg would be working directly with Zelensky and that they had a good rapport. But here's the thing. According to the transcript, Kellogg was already appointed back in November 2024.
Yeah, that's the weird part. Like, why is Trump posting about this now? Did he just get the dates mixed up? Or is there something else going on?
I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Is he just getting bad information? Or is he intentionally trying to create confusion?
I don't know. It's hard to say. But I think it definitely raises some questions about, Trump's grasp of current events and his, let's just say his accuracy when it comes to these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's not exactly reassuring, is it? Especially given that Trump still has a lot of influence and he could potentially run for president again.
Absolutely. And, the transcript also talks about how Trump's, let's call them strained relationships with other world leaders are having a real impact on international relations.
Right, there's that part about French President Macron encouraging other countries to buy French military equipment instead of American, specifically because of how Trump treated his allies in the past.
Yeah, that's pretty damning. It basically says that Trump's actions have damaged America's reputation to the point where other countries are now looking elsewhere for their defense needs.
Yeah, it's a real blow to American influence, and it just goes to show how important it is to have strong, reliable relationships with your allies, especially in a time like this when there's so much instability in the world.
Absolutely.
Okay, so there's one more thing about Trump that we need to talk about, and it's this whole thing with the Alien Enemies Act. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but this seems pretty extreme, even for Trump. He's basically claiming that there's a U.S. invasion happening from Venezuela through this hybrid gang, I think it's called Tren de Aragua, and he's invoking wartime powers to deal with it.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting, I guess you could say.
Interesting might be one word for it, but like I said, I'm not a legal expert. But the Alien Enemies Act seems like something that's usually reserved for times of war, like an actual declared war.
Yeah, historically it's been used against citizens of enemy nations who are present in the U.S. during wartime. But it seems like Trump is trying to apply it to this gang situation, which, is definitely a stretch, to say the least.
Right, and the transcript points out that there are already laws in place to deal with gang activity, so it's like, why is he even bringing this up? What's his motivation here?
Well, I think you have to consider the timing of this. It's happening at the same time as all these protests are breaking out in Eastern Europe against leaders that Trump admires. So you could interpret this as a way for Trump to project an image of strength domestically, to rally his base by creating a sense of external threat.
Yeah, it's like he's saying, look, we're under attack. We need to be strong. We need a leader who's tough on crime.
Exactly. And I think it plays into this whole narrative of America being under siege, which is something that Trump has been pushing for a long time.
Yeah, it's all about fear, isn't it? Creating a sense of fear and then presenting yourself as the only one who can protect people from it. Okay, so we've talked about the protests. We've talked about the coalition of the willing. We've talked about Trump. Now let's talk about the big guy himself, Vladimir Putin. How's he reacting to all of this?
Well, the transcript describes Putin as feeling cornered, which I think is a pretty apt description. You've got these protests happening in countries that are traditionally friendly to Russia. You've got this coalition of European and Canadian leaders who are actively working to support Ukraine and undermine Putin's efforts. It's got to be putting a lot of pressure on him.
Yeah, I can't imagine he's too happy about any of this. So how is that pressure manifesting itself? What's he doing about it?
Well, the transcript mentions this phone call that Putin had with Trump, where he supposedly lied about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. He claimed that Russian forces had encircled Ukrainian troops near Kyiv, which, according to the transcript, wasn't true.
So he's resorting to misinformation, trying to manipulate the narrative.
Yeah, it seems like it. And the transcript goes on to say that during this phone call, Putin proposed a deal that was contingent on Ukraine remaining disarmed, which, that's basically saying that Ukraine has to surrender in order to have peace.
Yeah, that's not exactly a fair negotiation, is it? And it sounds a lot like what he's been saying publicly about needing to address the root causes of the conflict. It's all about getting Ukraine to disarm and essentially give up its sovereignty.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how Zelensky responded to this claim of encirclement. He basically called it Putin propaganda and denied it outright.
Yeah, he's not letting Putin control the narrative. He's pushing back and asserting his own version of events.
Absolutely. And I think what's really significant is that Zelensky also claims that the negotiating power is shifting. He says that Europe and Ukraine are now taking a more prominent role in shaping the outcome of the conflict.
So it's not just about Russia and the U.S. anymore. It's becoming a more multilateral effort.
Yeah, it seems like it. And that's a big shift from how things were, even just a few months ago. It seems like the world is waking up to the threat that Putin poses, and they're starting to take action.
Yeah, it's like there's a growing realization that this isn't just a regional conflict. This is something that has the potential to destabilize the entire world order.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we're seeing this surge of support for Ukraine from countries all over the world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen protests erupt in Eastern Europe against leaders who are aligned with Russia and admired by Trump. We've seen a coalition of European and Canadian allies step up to support Ukraine and pressure Putin, even as the U.S. seems to be taking a backseat. We've seen Zelensky skillfully maneuvering on the diplomatic front, while Putin resorts to misinformation and strong-arm tactics. And we've seen Trump making some, well, let's just say questionable moves and statements.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind, but I think the key takeaway here is that the international landscape is changing. The old alliances and power structures are being challenged, and new ones are emerging. And I think that's both exciting and a little bit scary.
Yeah, because it means that we're entering uncharted territory, and no one really knows what's going to happen next. But one thing is for sure, the stakes are incredibly high, and the decisions that are made in the coming months could have a profound impact on the world for years to come.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important for people to be informed about what's happening, to understand the complexities of this situation, and to think critically about the information that they're being given.
Right, because knowledge is power. And in a time like this, when there's so much misinformation and propaganda flying around, it's more important than ever to be able to discern the truth from the lies.
Exactly. So to kind of wrap things up here, I think there's a really important question that I want to leave our listeners with. And that is, how might these internal pressures within countries like Hungary and Serbia, combined with the external diplomatic efforts that we've been discussing, how might all of that ultimately impact the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine and the broader geopolitical environment? What are the potential long-term consequences of these apparent shifts in alliances and leadership? It's a lot to think about, but I think it's worth pondering.
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought. And it just goes to show that the world is a complex and ever-changing place. And the only way to navigate it is to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay critical. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.